we are going to now hear from Jasmine. So Jasmine Sussex is from Australia and she is Australian, and she is up in the middle of the night incredibly kindly to talk to us. And thank you so much, Jasmine, for staying up and being with us today. And the title of Jasmine's talk is Women Being Called Far Right and Nazi in Australia. So thank you so much, Jasmine, and over to you.
I have been called some version of a Nazi for a good 2 decades. When I first started training as a breastfeeding counsellor, I used to be called a nipple Nazi because apparently breastfeeding counsellors, some of them, not me, could be a little bit intense about their kind of breastfeeding education and support. So I shouldn't really make light of it because obviously it's a terrible thing to describe anybody as a Nazi, but since those days, quite a lot has changed, and unfortunately, calling feminists and TERFs Nazis or accusing them of being from the far right has, I think it's fair to say, kind of become a state-sanctioned pastime in my lovely country of Australia. So, although it did happen before the Kelly J. Keane Melbourne 2023 Women Will Speak, Let Women Speak. I always get them confused now because we have our own description of these events in Australia, which is Women Will Speak. And then we obviously also hosted Kelly J out in Australia with the Let Women Speak event, which probably it's fair to say really kind of accelerated this description of TERFs and feminists as being Nazis or far right. So I have a little bit of a rundown of some of the key events that have pushed this description of us since that Let Women Speak event in March 2023. So almost immediately at that event, unfortunately, some attention-seeking men in black who were neo-Nazis did gate crash the event and stood on the steps of Parliament some space away from where the women were standing on the steps of Parliament. And the story ended up being that Nazis had joined our event and that we were somehow associated with the Nazis. So for those of you who don't know, there's a woman called Moira Deeming, who's a Conservative politician, Member of Parliament in Victoria, which is where Melbourne is down the south of Australia. And she almost immediately, having attended that event and helped Kelly to organise the event, was called in to explain to her leadership, John Pesutto, and then the next day, the next working day, the 20th of March, it was announced that they intended to expel her from the party. So, and in and amongst all of that, although Moira took the kind of first wave of the heat as the Nazi associate, the Premier, who's a Labor Premier, he stood up in Parliament and talked about that hateful, nasty event and flew the trans flag from Parliament House, and the number of members of the federal government, who's also a Labor government, particularly those who had strong Jewish electorates, spoke up against the hateful event and what a disgrace it was that the Nazis had, allied with the women to perpetuate this hateful, transphobic kind of message. So it was all quite grim, I think, is perhaps the best way to describe what was happening. But then, I don't know if you remember, but the lovely Miss Al-Salem did kind of come to our rescue a little bit. And I know that some of the things that she said applied to other countries, but we did feel quite strongly that a lot of what she said in that particular statement, which was really kind of a warning to governments, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, or, the global North, I think they call it, which amusingly, Australia is part of the global North, despite being in the South. But anyway, she spoke about how governments really shouldn't be trying to shame women or vilify women into talking about our sex-based rights. And she talked about our right to protest and our right to talk about the intersection between gender and sex-based rights. We think she was talking about us. I'll just put it that way. And she did specifically mention Moira Deeming as well at the time. Actually came on TV in Australia to talk about how Moira was being treated. So we're still recovering really from all of that, although we've had a number of positive developments since then. So at the end of that year, the Federal Parliament and the Legal Affairs Committee called for submissions on the rise of right-wing extremism in Australia, and a number of the submissions were about the Let Women Speak event and the hateful actions of, they'd always sort of talk about Nazis, but it was always at the Let Women Speak event, and Kelly J was always mentioned. So we all got slurred continually. And then early the following year, we had the Australian Human Rights Commission launch her own inquiry because, she wouldn't want to be left behind, looking into threats to trans and gender diverse human rights. And at one of our feminist organisations, Australian Feminists for Women's Rights, AFOLWA, they've been in a, since then, ongoing escalating freedom of information process with the Australian Human Rights Commission to identify whose idea this inquiry was, what its scope was, if they were hearing from women, how it was identified that there were increasing threats to trans and gender diverse human rights, etc. And that's still going. So, thanks to them. So through this time, Moira Deeming, the Conservative, or, we call it the Liberal Party, but it's the conservative side of politics in Australia, was getting lawyered up with the best defamation lawyers in the country, which was excellent to see, and issuing a range of concerns notices against her former boss, who by then had expelled her and continued to defame her. So that all continued to happen. And then we had another very troubling incident, which Sheila, I think's here, was witness to. The Lesbian Action Group, which many of you may know about, have been in a ongoing legal process with our Australian Human Rights Commission because they were denied their human rights to run an event with lesbians who are lesbians. So to not include men who claim they're lesbians. And they were denied that exemption from the Sex Discrimination Act. And then they appealed to the AAT, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And the Australian Human Rights Commission, in their wisdom, took evidence from a woman who's an advocate for the prostitution industry, or as she would say, the sex industry, who said that lesbians are akin to fascists. And the barrister for the Australian Human Rights Commission didn't have any problems with that. And so there's an ongoing process around that is still unfolding, but obviously it's extremely concerning that the federal government would put evidence like that before a senior member of that tribunal. Oh, forward. Okay, so jump to the next year. The defamation process is continuing. We had 3 weeks in federal court where a brilliant barrister defended not only Moira Deeming's reputation, but all the women who attended the Let Women Speak event. And I just jumped to stage. Anyway, so sorry, no, I didn't. That was right. That happened. And then in April, we had a really important case in the family court where the judge, Justice Andrew Strum, rejected evidence given by a paediatrician from a children's hospital that transitions children in my home state in Victoria. And she said that people who don't want to give puberty blockers to children are akin to Nazism. And this was in her expert evidence to the family court case, which was looking at whether or not a little boy should be given puberty blockers when his father thought he shouldn't and his mother thought he should. And thankfully, Justice Andrew Strum was very, I'm trying to think quite the right word, very strongly rejected that evidence, and also took, great offence at the outrageous kind of reduction of the horror of Nazism to apply it to a situation that it's just obscene, really, to apply it to. So that was really positive for us. And then we had the defamation judgment, which was in Moira Deeming's favour, and in May this year. And so the man who said that Moira Deeming was associated with people who were associated with Nazis had to pay her 300,000 Australian dollars in damages, and he also had to pay her legal costs and his legal costs. And her legal costs were $2.3 million. And I'm not quite sure we know what his legal costs were, but we assume similar, because the two warring sides actually had the two top defamation lawyers in the country. So, so you would think that after such a salutary lesson, that journalists and politicians would be very careful in throwing the N-word around in relation to women. And it has definitely helped, but surprisingly, we are still being called Nazis. And I was, with some other women, set up a new organisation called Women's Voices Australia in March this year, to help to elevate opposition to some new vilification laws that are coming in my home state, which are going to be very, very, very grim. So, and also to organise some Women Will Speak events so we could talk about this topic, and also hopefully so that we could talk about issues that are important to us without being called Nazis. So I'll just catch up a little bit on some of the visuals of what I've just talked about. So this was at the beginning of the Let Women Speak event back in March 2023, where, almost straight away Moira said that she'll be fighting moves to kick her out of the party for attending the Melbourne rally where the Nazis were. And here you can see the beautiful Moira Deeming and your Kelly in the right-hand side. But it wasn't just Moira who had been defamed by this process. One of our local women who's done a power of work, Angela Jones, who was one of the co-organisers, who's, a single mum with 4 kids living in the suburbs, was also defamed very badly and called a Nazi associate, which is particularly ironic in her case because her great aunt, I think it was, is Jewish. So yeah. Anyway, Ange did manage to get an apology out of Mr. Pseudo before Moira's defamation case was resolved, but she's still struggling with the aftermath and is still in some protracted legal processes around that. So it's certainly, there's the high profile women, and then there's the next level of women, and then there's all the kind of ordinary women, and all of them are damaged in different ways when we get called Nazis and far right. So this was, as I mentioned before, what Reem said about, we go back, about her concerns back in May. So she was talking about us being called Nazis, genocidaires. I'd never heard that word before. I love that word. Well, her using the word, and extremists, and her calling out specifically that they were used to intimidate and silence us. So I just kind of keep it a little bit light. Hopefully you can identify the difference between women talking about their sex-based rights and fascists. So the first photos are from our event that we organised in April, the Women Will Speak event. So here we have Michelle and Nina. Nina was singing the women's rights song that our Scottish sisters, I think they wrote it to the Old Lang Syne song. And Michelle is a well-known women's rights activist and feminist. I think she'd call herself a feminist as well, from my home state, who's organised a series of these events as well. So I wonder if they're fascists. What about these ones? Don't think so. Ah, it's kind of easy to pick the difference, I would say, but you know, that's just me. So these were the men who gate crashed our event back in May, and they have a bit of a Nazi vibe about them, don't they? A little bit different. When we were planning our event, we did give instructions to women not to wear black, and if possible to wear suffragette colours. But even then, some of the police got a little bit confused when they were shepherding women through the police, cordon, and the women just had to point out to them that they were wearing suffragette colours and that they could go through. So that seemed to work quite well, which was good. So in terms of this event, this new organisation that we set up, the Women's Voices Australia, to host these Women Will Speak events, I think some of the things that I've learned out of the process is that sometimes, you know, if at first you don't succeed, perhaps rebrand. So as unfair as it is, you know, there were some quite fixed views in Australia about our friends from England coming over and what it was that they represented. So we did really need to kind of take it into our own hands to be able to have a conversation about our politics and what we were trying to achieve and how that was relevant and different in the local context. So we did establish this new apolitical group, which drew on all the other groups, but, you know, sort of had a different space, I guess, in that it was about organising these events and elevating women's voices. So Women's Action Group became Women's Voices Australia. And then I guess really what I brought to the process was the proactive media management and pre-event story placement. So, you know, like when Kelly J came to town, it's like there's a lot of excitement and it kind of, you know, the caravan rolls in and there's a lot of hype, but there aren't necessarily those kind of relationships with journalists that are based on, you know, briefing packs and many weeks of understanding about what we're trying to achieve and coffees and all of these sorts of things, which when you're trying to tell a complicated, difficult story, you do really need to do those sorts of things. So this was probably the kind of exciting result. So this is The Age, which is our broadsheet paper in our hometown. And they reported on the kind of, it was a real 180 in their description of our event. So, and we were able to work with the police as well to invoke special powers so that they could protect us, which was the first time they've ever used those powers. And meant that we could be heard, like Reem El Salem called for back in 2023, that it's not just enough for us to be safe when we're protesting, but we need to be heard. So the police pushed the trans activists back on the other side of the street. It's like our parliaments are like your Victorian parliaments, you know, they're massive limestone kind of buildings that, you know, go from one side of the block to the other. Anyway, so we were on one side and the trans activists were on the other side behind police barricades, behind horses. So we could actually hear each other, which was amazing and exciting. So just to kind of wrap up, because I realize I've spoken for longer than I thought I would. The reason I wanted to give this talk was I came to one of these a couple of weeks ago and I noticed all the women were talking about being called Nazis in their respective countries. And I think it was France, Brazil, and maybe there was an American. So yeah, obviously this is something that they're doing to us globally. So I think it's really important that every time it happens, we don't just ignore it and that we complain to whoever we can complain to. You use whatever low cost, cheap to free quasi-judicial process is available to you. You know, require government to do its job. know that women's reputations need defending and they're important. And then I guess also just to be aware that it's the women who use their real names in these processes that kind of incur the most damage. So just trying to find a way to kind of share that around, if you can, is, I think, important. So I've got some references, which I should probably try and put in the thingo, in the chat. But yeah, there's quite a lot about our event in April this year, and how that kind of changed the story in Melbourne around women's sex-based rights. So yeah, I will leave it there and see if you have any questions.